Dear friends, following an initiative of the Baha'i Council of Alberta, Vida and I recently participated in a number of gatherings in that beautiful province where we discussed the movement of clusters with the friends coming from areas where milestone 3 has passed separately than those coming from milestone 1 and 2. I found the experience very useful and later on benefited from similar discussions in a summer school in London, Ontario. Encouraged by some of the friends in Alberta and in London, I am sharing today with you the summary of what we explored in these gatherings under the heading The Movement of Clusters and the 9-Year Plan. Humanity stands at its age of collective adolescence. During the period of its collective infancy and childhood, it has successively organized itself by unifying in families, in clans, in tribes, in city-states, and in nations. As it enters the period of its collective maturity, its destiny is to organize itself by unifying globally, resulting in the unification of the entire human race as members of one family. This is the vision Baha'u'llah has come to fulfill by empowering humanity during the transition from the age of adolescence to its age of collective maturity. To bring about this vision, God has two plans, the major and the minor plan. The major plan of God can be compared to the coming of the season of spring. As the spring creates conditions for growth and opens the way for and supports the efforts of all those who wish to cultivate the land, the major plan of God opens ways for and removes obstacles to desired change and organic development in the world. The minor plan of God is aimed at learning how to build a society shaped by the divine teachings and bring about the vision of Baha'u'llah. We do not have a say in the major plan as Baha'u'llah directly oversees that process. However, humanity has an important role to play in the minor plan of God as implemented under the guidance of the institutions created by Baha'u'llah. And the Baha'is have been given a specific task and a mission in this regard. The mission evolves over time, but has always included developing a deeper understanding of the revelation of Baha'u'llah, as well as learning how to bring about the expansion and consolidation of the Baha'i community and fostering its involvement in the life of society at large. The 9-year plan represents the current stage of the minor plan of God as guided by the Universal House of Justice. The Baha'is are of course ecstatic at the thought of Baha'u'llah unifying the human race as members of one family, and are also moved deeply by the bounty of having been given a mission to play in this divinely ordained plan. But the truth is that some of us may also at times feel a little wary when we consider that so many people are still unaware of the message of Baha'u'llah. Nay, a large population of the world is still focused on a way of life that does not encourage it to pay adequate attention to the remedy prescribed by Baha'u'llah. Our communities are still small, and the golden age of the civilization promised in the Baha'i writings is not yet apparent on the horizon. What will help all of us not to be discouraged is to remember that the cause of Baha'u'llah will have to progress through stages before humanity can witness the dawning of the golden age. Shoghi Effendi talks about the countless issues that must be faced, the obstacles that must be overcome, and the responsibilities that must be assumed to enable a sore-tried faith to pass through the successive stages which must ultimately culminate in the emergence of the worldwide Baha'i Commonwealth, animated wholly by the Spirit and operating solely in direct conformity with the laws and principles of Baha'u'llah. In the light of this understanding, we realize that each generation of Baha'is has a special role to play in this process, that the progress of the work done by one generation rests on the efforts of those who come before, that the final victory is absolutely guaranteed. Therefore, each generation must rise with focus to carry out the current tasks, no matter what the sacrifice. Developing a deeper understanding of the revelation of Baha'u'llah occurs gradually as we attend to the tasks we are charged with. Dividing the history of the faith into periods of 19 years since the declaration of the Bab, and looking at the progress achieved in each such period has helped me see with what an amazing speed the cause of God has progressed. How it has passed from phase to phase to today's stage when our focus is on learning how to release the society building power of the faith in ever larger measures. In such a review, one can see how the tree of the cause of God was planted on earth and began to grow with unprecedented sacrifices of the friends. How each generation learned to share the message of Baha'u'llah with multitudes and in a variety of settings, to quicken souls and help them on their own path for service, to empower Baha'i women to exercise their responsibilities as equals of men, to raise generations of children and youth upon whom the vitality of the faith and the future of humanity necessarily depend, to assist individuals and families to free themselves from prejudices of all kinds, to give constant, persistent, and patient attention to the development of the administrative order of Baha'u'llah, thereby enabling the human race to learn to work together in a process of civilization building that involves engaging in a host of other related undertakings. For instance, the efforts of the past generations during the 20th century for the expansion and consolidation of the community has been so colossal that the Universal House of Justice says it is safe to say that there was virtually no type of teaching activity, no combination of expansion and consolidation, no administrative option, no effort at cultural adaptation that was not being energetically tried in some parts of the world. But we also know that even the growth of the Baha'i community will pass through different stages, from a steady flow of believers to entry by troops and finally mass conversion. Describing this, Shoghi Effendi explains that a steady flow and the vitalizing influx of new blood into the community will hasten the advent of the day which, as promised by Abdul Baha, will witness the entry by troops of peoples of diverse nations and races into the Baha'i world, a day which will be the prelude to that long-awaited hour when a mass conversion on the part of these same nations and races will suddenly revolutionize the fortunes of the faith, rearrange the equilibrium of the world, and reinforce 1,000-fold the numerical strength as well as the material power and the spiritual authority of the faith of Baha'u'llah. By 1963, the conclusion of the 10-year crusade, and 100 years after the first public declarations of Baha'u'llah, the vitalizing influx of new blood into the Baha'i community from diverse tribes and nations had taken place and continued to do so in the decades that followed. Entry by troops in one form or another took place at different times and in different places. The ongoing challenge to sustain the process was to learn how the expansion and consolidation of the faith would move hand in hand. In 1996, the expansion and consolidation efforts began to grow stronger, deeper, and more complex as it was reinforced by a learning process. In 2006, the first glimmerings of an intensive program of growth emerged, and a new pattern of action consolidated in a small number of geographic areas. As of 2021, in the words of the Universal House of Justice, a conception of the process of entry by troops emerged that relied less on theories and assumptions and more on actual experience of how large numbers of people could find the faith, become familiar with it, identify with its aims, join in its activities and deliberations, and in many cases, embrace it. At the heart of what was learned about the process is the Training Institute, the engine for growth, an educational program based on the words of God. In addition, several elements of growth and their components were identified that needed to be functioning. These elements include the multiplications of core activities and their integration, a successful outreach to local inhabitants, an ever-growing number of individuals and collective teaching initiatives, a vibrant Baha'i community life, a commitment to an ongoing learning process, as well as integration of arts and the involvement of youth as a driving force of the process. Furthermore, conditions conducive to growth were understood to involve issues such as a pronounced spirit of collaboration among the institutions, a reasonable degree of administrative capacity, and the involvement of a number of assistant to auxiliary board members in the community building process. And lastly, many important concepts and practices impacting growth began to receive attention. Among them, cycles of growth, acting in a posture of learning, increasing institutional capacity at diverse levels, accompaniment of those engaged in the work, universal participation, a coherent life of service, social action, and involvement in the discourses of society. The combination of all these points shape up what is referred to as the Institute process, a process of capacity building, enabling everyone who is interested to participate and become a protagonist in the minor plan of God. A vigorous Institute process itself then is referred to as an element of growth. One of the very important things that has been learned is the concept of a cluster as a geographic construct intended to facilitate thinking about the growth of the faith. Clusters were identified not so much on the conditions of the Baha'i community, but mostly based on the way the larger society was interacting, communicating, and functioning. An ever-expanding program of growth was to be established in every cluster. Gradually, the movement of clusters along a development path marked by a series of milestones was understood and followed up. The House of Justice stated at the start that the chief aim of a program of growth right from the beginning, and regardless of the size of the Baha'i community in the cluster, is to initiate a process for building capacity within the cluster through which its inhabitants, prompted by a wish to contribute to the spiritual and material well-being of their communities, are enabled to begin offering acts of service. The ultimate goal of a program of growth, therefore, is for all the inhabitants of the cluster to consider themselves protagonists in the process. Not to lose the sight of the fact that the focus of the institute process is and should stay on the whole population of the larger society is a challenge. The process, of course, begins with a small group of participants studying institute courses and offering one or another of the acts of service the courses recommend. With the rise in the number of people studying these courses, the process of growth advances. For these advances to take place, the principal issues include raising the number and enhancing the capacity of those serving as tutors, sustaining a steady flow of participants through the sequence of courses, and coordinating the Institute's efforts through effective mechanisms. Those serving as tutors have a special task. Their challenge, in the words of the Universal House of Justice, is to provide an environment conducive to the spiritual empowerment of individuals who will come to see themselves as active agents of their own learning, as protagonists of a constant effort to apply knowledge to effect individual and collective transformations. The House of Justice goes on to note that failing this, no matter how many study circles are formed in a cluster, the force necessary to propel change will not be generated. Once an initial flow of human resources into the field of systematic action takes place, the number of activities increases, a relatively small number of individuals shoulder responsibility for an increasing expansion and consolidation process, and a few facilitate the participations of tens of individuals in the activities, the cluster could be said to have passed milestone 1. Establishing such a process is a significant achievement. The House of Justice tells us, let no one fail to appreciate the possibilities thus created, that the Baha'i world has succeeded in developing a culture which promotes a way of thinking, studying, and acting in which all consider themselves as treading a common path of service, supporting one another and advancing together, is an accomplishment of enormous proportions. And therein lie the dynamics of an irrepressible movement. Gradually, the Friends come to recognize that for the expansion and consolidation to accelerate, it is essential that the institute process in the cluster should become more and more vigorous, and that this can be achieved through a systematic learning approach and paying constant attention simultaneously to two sets of issues which I mentioned earlier on. One is the number of what is referred to as elements of growth, ensuring that each one exists in the cluster and also functions at a reasonable degree of effectiveness. And second is the incorporation of important concepts and practices, as well as the conditions that stimulate growth. Working towards this goal heralds the maturation of an ever-expanding, self-sustaining system for the spiritual edification of a population. Under such conditions, a steady stream of friends is proceeding through the courses of the training institutes and engaging in the corresponding activities. Some strengths of the training institute and a scheme of coordination are discerned. All the elements of a system necessary for growth to be sustained are in place. The number of core activities exceeds 20, and tens of people facilitate the participations of a few hundred individuals. This constitutes a cluster that has passed milestone 2. Paying systematic attention to all elements of growth was emphasized by the Universal House of Justice when, in its message of 25th of November 2020, addressed to the Baha'is of the world, the Supreme Body said, "For it is within the context of a flourishing community, especially a center of intense activity in a village or neighborhood, and when each element of the plan's framework is given the attention it requires, that those elements most visibly cohere and connect, multiplying the community's powers in the field of action." Over time, the community building efforts sustain a high degree of participation in all aspects of the capacity building endeavor and manages the complexity entailed in the process. The aim now, in the words of the Universal House of Justice, is the appearance of a system for expanding a dynamic pattern of community life that can engage a people, men and women, youth and adults, in the work of their own spiritual and social transformation. Intense activity begins to occur in specific neighborhoods or villages, while at the same time concerted efforts are made by the generality of the believers living across the cluster. In other words, a rising spirit of universal participation in the work of community building is witnessed. The Training Institute learns to ensure that sufficient human resources are being raised to provide for the spiritual and moral edification of children and junior youth in ever-increasing numbers. The faith educational efforts take on a more formal character as children move seamlessly through the grades year after year, and one level of the junior youth spiritual empowerment program reliably succeeds another. The number of core activities exceeds 100. The cluster learns how to welcome large numbers into the embrace of the process, and hundreds of people facilitate the participation of thousands in the activities of community life. This constitutes milestone 3. In brief, dear friends, if the distinguishing character of a milestone 1 cluster can be said to be an initial flow of human resources into the field of systematic action, and for milestone 2 cluster, an acceleration of the expansion and consolidation, in a milestone 3 cluster, the process should denote the appearance of a system for extending a dynamic pattern of community life to the people in the cluster. Today, the number of activities in some of the milestone 3 clusters are in the thousands, and participants number in the tens of thousands. Once the activities of the plan reach such a degree of prevalence, the inhabitants possess a substantially increased capacity to steer the course of their own development, and the institutions and agencies of the faith there now have an expanded vision of their responsibilities. And on the horizon is milestone 4, as yet undefined, referring to those clusters anticipating a breakthrough in the movement of population through the entire process. Much, of course, remains to be learned and done, but the essential challenge of maintaining a balance between the processes of expansion and consolidation that the Baha'i world faced in 1996 has been met. But to understand better what a milestone 1, 2, and 3 cluster means, use of analogy may help. Let's try and compare it with something that maybe all of us are more familiar. A milestone 1 cluster, maybe it can be compared to when an individual begins a physical exercise program and invites a few friends to join him. A milestone 2 clusters, then, maybe we can say compare it to when so many people have joined the exercise that the need arises to plan for more trainers, more space, more equipment, and even some administrative support. In such a scenario, a milestone 3 cluster would be equivalent to when it becomes apparent that a system is needed to reach an increasingly large number of inhabitants and inspire them to join the physical exercise program and ultimately take charge of their own health through physical exercise. Let's say that this is a reasonable comparison. In such a case, this system will naturally include larger gyms, adequate equipment, plans for building gyms in other neighborhoods, and training more people as instructors. The institute process, and at the heart of it, the training institute, are intended to provide the equipment and the instruments and the management needed for the exercise of the transformation of society. When I used this analogy in a recent gathering in Calgary and said I'm not sure of its relevance, one kind person in the audience came to me later on and shared with me his idea of another possible analogy to make the point I was trying to make. He said he is an agronomist and offered an agriculturally related analogy, which I like, as I am also an agronomist by profession. And that's this: when a new variety of a crop becomes available that meets the current needs of a population, the first step usually is to grow it in a few nearby locations, thereby allowing a small number of farmers to observe and adopt its cultivation. Based on the experience gained, preparations are then made to secure the services of a few more skilled people to grow the new crops by an increasing number of interested farmers in wider geographic areas. Once this knowledge and the associated insights are gained, what is needed is an extension program, an agricultural extension program, an extension system to reach out to the entire population of the farmers of the area, introducing the new variety and providing whatever is needed for them to be able to grow it and benefit from it. If we compare the first and the second phase of this agricultural exercise to a milestone 1 and 2 cluster, the implementation of an extension program is comparable to what we should be doing in a milestone 3 cluster. All of this to say that in a milestone 3 cluster, learning how to sustainably embrace increasingly large numbers from the wider society in our community building efforts should be the focus. We have seen the efficacy of the transformative power of the Training Institute in relation to the Baha'i community. Wherever larger numbers from the wider society have entered the Institute courses, have been engaged in acts of service, and have been immersed in the Institute process, the power of the Institute to transform society has also been witnessed. Could we not then conclude that the larger the numbers from the wider society who are participating in the activities, the stronger the process of community will be, and the more visible will be the signs of the release of the society building power of the faith. This recognition, combined with a deeper understanding of why the message of Baha'u'llah is indeed the sovereign remedy for every disease humanity is facing, is the key, friends, to becoming more effective in our efforts aimed at releasing the society building power of the faith in ever greater measures. In locations where the community building process began with initially no or few Baha'is, there was no choice other than focusing on working with the people from the wider society. The community building efforts, therefore, was rightfully seen from the beginning as the movement of a population, in this case, the inhabitants of the cluster. Knowing that for the movement of a population, more and more people from that population must necessarily walk the path of service, and that the process of study and action has to take root in the population itself, the learning was focused on walking this path, and an essential element of the transformation of society, that's the participation of increasing numbers in the institute courses, was incorporated into the process right from the beginning. There are today clusters that have passed milestone 3, where the process originally began with a sizable Baha'i population. It is possible that in some of these places, the friends chose, at least initially, the easier path of focusing to work with the Baha'is and did not act sufficiently upon the concept of the movement of a population. In such clusters, the process of community building work may have left its mark on the believers more as a series of activities whose numbers must be multiplied rather than the movement of a population. This perception, of course, can impede progress towards learning the release of the society building power of the faith. In such clusters, even though the number of activities help the cluster to pass milestone 3, but experience in attracting, inviting, and nurturing the participation of an increasing number of souls from the wider society could be very limited. In such clusters, it is not unusual to see that even if the number of people engaged in the conversation is relatively high, but the number of participants from the wider society, particularly in the educational activities, and consequently the number of people from the wider society who are protagonists and take on the responsibility of rendering their own services, are low and scarce. In such clusters, a new mindset is needed so as to be able to see the wider society as the main reservoir of human resources, a mindset that should guide the movement of clusters throughout the 9-year plan. During the early years of the 9-year plan, every cluster, in my opinion, regardless of its stage of development, will benefit from a fresh reflection on the guidance of the House of Justice on the dynamics of the movement of a population. In milestone 1 and 2 clusters, such reflection would include examining the strategies aimed at multiplication and integration of core activities, learning how to increase participation not only from the Baha'i communities, but also from the society at large, taking all possible measures to ensure that more regular and more systematic attention is given to learning not only how to involve an increasing number of people from the wider society in our educational activities, but also how to empower an increasing number of individuals to render acts of service and become protagonists of the community building efforts. In another word, ensuring that all the possible necessary measures are being taken now in preparation for having a functional system in place for the purpose of reaching out to the population at large when they got to milestone 3. In milestone 3 clusters, where the bulk of the work to reach 100 or more activities has been achieved by the participation of the Baha'is, the Friends and the cluster agencies should, in my humble opinion, make a conscious shift in thinking and begin systematic learning about how to act upon the concept of the movement of a population. The capacity to understand and conduct a systematic approach to learning how to move a population step by step is indeed central to the healthy development of a milestone 3 cluster. If this capacity is missing or it needs nurturing, working hard on it becomes at once urgent and a great opportunity for progress. Study of a compilation of the guidance of the Universal House of Justice on the movement of a population can be a very effective starting point. Such a study will naturally be followed by learning in action, aimed at developing the necessary capacities in the cluster. The whole idea of learning, friends, is that we learn how to do things that we do not know how to do it yet. With clarity of mind, the cluster can concentrate on one object of learning after another. If their challenge is that they currently do not know what the movement of a population effectively implies, they must immediately engage in a systematic approach to learn about it. If they realize they do not know what to say to people to interest them in participating in the courses of the Institute, that's what they must focus on learning. If they realize that they do not know how to keep them involved in the process, they must focus on learning that. If they do not know how to support new people to take responsibility to carry out their own acts of service, that's what the focus of learning should be. The Friends should also know that somewhere in another cluster or even in another part of the world, someone has learned how to do these things, and they should draw from the experience to learn how to do it in their own circumstances. Such a focus on more systematic learning will assuredly enhance the movement of clusters when it is combined with a more systematic approach to planning, as highlighted in the 9-year plan. The House of Justice has offered 2 specific related guidance. One is that a greater expression of the society building power of the faith requires still further advances in the process of entry by troops, and the second being the movement of clusters along a continuum of development will remain the basic model for the expansion and consolidation of the community as described in the previous plans. In practice, this means that we will be following the same core activities as before, but through the lens of learning how to release in ever greater measures the society building power of the faith. The implications and the shift required by this guidance should also be given additional attention by the cluster agencies. The House of Justice encourages us to perceive the work of the plan as 2 essentially spiritual undertakings and clarifies that each has measurable outcomes. The concept of spiritual undertakings having measurable outcomes should encourage us not to hesitate to make efforts to measure the progress we intend to achieve, no matter how lofty the idea is. Setting simple, measurable goals related to each of the 2 spiritual undertakings, delineating a path towards achieving each goal, and undertaking periodic assessment of the progress being made are among the various practical steps that this shift demands. Consider, for instance, a milestone 3 cluster with a few hundred core activities achieved mostly through participation of the Baha'is. The cluster agencies, with the help and guidance of the auxiliary board members, would do well to aim at learning how participation of an increasing number of people from the wider society can be the central goal and how can it be achieved. Setting a number as the goal to be achieved within a certain period of time will help determine the scale of what needs to be done. Such plans do not have to be complicated. As few as 1 or 2 or 3, if required, realistic and measurable goals, and the path to achieve each of the goals can constitute a plan. A cluster can simultaneously have a few small plans, the totality of which will result in a more vigorous institute process, more growth, and more human resources from the wider society. 4 interrelated plans immediately come to my mind as essential for as many of our clusters that I am familiar with. First, a plan to strengthen the training institute at the cluster level. The specific goal can be moving 2 or 3 elements of the training institute in the cluster during the next, say, 12 months, from where they are to the next step of strength. The path to achieve these and to assess progress will have to be also highlighted. The second would be a plan to increase the efficacy of the cycles of growth in the cluster. The goal will be again the improvement from where they are to the next step of 2 or 3 things that would increase the efficacy of the cycles of growth in the cluster. Again, the path to achieve each goal and how to assess progress will also have to be outlined. The third one that comes to my mind is a plan to reinforce the centrality of home visit to the process of community building, not only to address the issue of the believers' isolation, but also to increase the level of participation in meaningful conversations that naturally result in participation in the core activities. 2 or 3 initial issues that can be addressed in the next few months or next 12 months, and the improvements expected can be identified and the path to achieve also highlighted. And the fourth would be a plan to help an increasing number of believers to fan within their hearts a passion for teaching and to reflect periodically on effective ways of teaching the faith in their surroundings. Specific, measurable, and realistic goals to be achieved within a period of time, again, should be identified, and the path to achieve them as well as the way to assess progress be clarified. Having such plans, friends, for a cluster can be very helpful in many ways. It can, among other benefits, make it easier for individuals, families, and the teaching teams to make their own plans and set their own goals, taking into account the plans of the cluster agencies. Another guidance of the House of Justice with significant impact, in my opinion, on our immediate efforts to further systematize our planning is when the Supreme Body says much can be learned from the experience of the friends in similar clusters for a community that is a step further along the same path can provide valuable insights about the goals to strive for next. Benefiting from the experience of a community that is a step further along the same path suggests to me that the path must be known to us step by step, and that we ought to know where we are on this path at any given time. Let us take the Training Institute at the cluster level as an example. Is there a unity of vision among the cluster agencies about the path a training institute should move along from milestone 1 to milestone 3 and beyond? How clear is such an understanding among those in the forefront of the work of the faith in the cluster? How apparent is to the institute staff, to the cluster agencies, and others the step-by-step practical meaning of systematic action aimed at strengthening the Training Institute? Is there an effective structure for the Training Institute at the cluster level for decision making and for taking responsibility to follow up the work aimed at strengthening the Training Institute? Are there some sort of instruments that can make it easier for us to approach the task of strengthening the institute process at the cluster level in a more systematic manner? By instrument, I mean anything that will assist us to think more logically, more systematically, and step by step. For instance, I have prepared, using the guidance of the House of Justice and for my own use, a list of issues involved in having an effective, functioning training institute. Use of this list helps me to be more systematic in remembering issues that need attention if a training institute is to be effective. I think the list can be improved to assist in thinking about what the next step is to strengthen each issue. Similar detailed analysis and use of instruments may prove useful in making efforts more systematic for improving the effectiveness of cycles of growth, home visits, and individual teaching. In addition to a focus on more systematic learning and a more systematic approach to planning, there is another significant guidance affecting the movement of clusters. Describing what a rising spirit of universal participation in the work of community building is, the House of Justice says it means the mobilization of a sizable number of Baha'is who are creatively and intelligently applying the plan's framework for action to the reality of their own circumstances wherever in the cluster they live. It entails families and individual believers working together and making a conscious decision to see themselves as belonging to an expanding nucleus. This is already happening in a number of clusters with the formation of nuclei of friends or teaching teams. My personal experience at the cluster level is that when the formation of a team is based on love and fellowship among the members, the result is the multiplications of power and capacities. The regular study of the guidance of the House of Justice would help members of a team to stay clear that they are not a group of friends to consult and agree by majority vote on how best to collaborate with each other to serve the faith. Rather, by forming a team, they have created a space where a few friends get together and commit themselves to learning in a systematic way how to creatively and intelligently apply the plan's framework for action to the reality of their own circumstances. Here, the importance of developing the capacity among the members of such teams to act with a posture of learning especially comes to light. Such teams come to know that the plan requires them to make decisions based on experience rather than on opinions and personal likes and dislikes, and that with the regularity of reflection meetings with more systematization, goal setting, and increase in the number of activities, and particularly in the level of participation from those from the wider society, progress and results can be significant. They come to know that the guidance of the plan works and works well. With more capacity, more can be achieved. The key here again, friends, is the capacity at the cluster level to assist and accompany these teams to familiarize themselves with the direction of the House of Justice, so as to learn how best to function in the light of this guidance. These were, dear friends, some of my thoughts about the movement of cluster at these early years of the 9-year plan, and I hope that you will find them useful. Thank you for your attention.